Hi everybody, welcome back to another social studies mini lesson. Last time we had a mini lesson, we were talking about the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. Well, I want us to get up from 1900 to 1920, and to do that, I'm going to break it into two videos. This video is going to be about how the Industrial Revolution continued and technology advanced. So let's tackle that first. The 1900s, early 1900s, really wasn't that much different from the late 1800s. Those first 10 years, 1900 to 1910, people were just getting more and more inventions out there, and these inventions became more accessible to people. Instead of the light bulb being a novelty and the radio being a novelty that only a few people had, people started getting these items and putting them in their homes. By 1908, Henry Ford was cranking out those Model Ts left and right because he wanted every family in America to have a car to drive. Interesting fact, 1901, the first license plate in the United States was printed, and it simply was the number 1. That's a cool thing to look up. There's an interesting story behind it that still exists today. The Wright brothers flew their first airplane, and the Panama Canal was built using technology that didn't exist before, with bulldozers and heavy earth movers, things like that. So there was a lot of technology, especially machinery, that helped out with life in general. The airplanes began to get bigger and better. The cars began to get more elaborate. The ships began to get more elaborate. The Titanic was actually made during this time period. It sank in 1912. That's another interesting story that you can Google. I would not recommend the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio because it's kind of overrated, really overrated. But there are a lot of documentaries out there, and there's a lot of information about the Titanic. So I'm going to leave that to you. You can study the Titanic as much or as little as you want. But just understand, all these things were getting bigger and better and bigger and better. There were some things going on during this time that were not so good and helpful in life. In 1906, there was a huge earthquake in San Francisco that basically leveled the city. So if you want to look up the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, that's got some interesting stories behind it too, and there are actually some children's books made about it that you might find interesting. So there you go, 2 topics you can look up on your own: Titanic, San Francisco earthquake of 1906. During this time, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president we have had, and that takes us up to our 19-teens. In 1914, a series of unfortunate events led to World War I. Now, in my next video, I'm going to talk about World War I, about how it started and why it started. That video is entitled, Who's Your BFF? Because some people pick the wrong friends. What I want to address in this video, though, is the technology used in World War I. In World War I, unlike in previous wars, there were tanks for the first time, armored tanks. That was a game changer. These tanks could roll right over people and bombs and things like that. It was bulletproof pretty much. So it was a vehicle that could be taken into battle. Like some other wars, they did use trench warfare. That's where each side dug a trench that was deep enough for men to walk through, and they would stick their heads up to fire their guns and get back down and reload. Problem, in Europe, it rains a lot during some seasons, and there were a lot of people who died from infection and things like that from the trenches. So that was not so good, but trenches had been used in other wars. Something else that had not been used was poisonous gas, specifically mustard gas. This was an acid that would blind people, it would eat into your lungs and it would kill people very painfully. So there were many attacks using this poisonous gas that killed many different soldiers. Previously, there are some other examples of different poisons and things being used in warfare, but this was the first time a chemical was manufactured and used in war specifically that we have documentation. Flamethrowers. My boys know what that is. Actually, most of you probably do. It's a gun that shoots flames. So this was the first time you had significant use of machine guns and flamethrowers. So you could do a lot of damage in a short amount of time. Planes. This was the first time airplanes were used in war. Think about the Red Baron. That's a German pilot. He was one of the most famous pilots in World War I. And Snoopy, if you've seen the Snoopy, the Peanut movie and everything, Snoopy is pretending to be a World War I flying ace. That's a pilot. So these soldiers, they would get up in their planes, which were usually little bitty prop planes, and they could look over the side, and they could actually drop the bombs on people as they flew over. Bad part, it was easy to get shot down. So you can look up World War I flying ace or the Red Baron, and you can find out a little bit more about these pilots and how they were used in warfare for the first time, World War I. Jeeps. This was the first time that we had vehicles like cars, things like that. So they had the first armored Jeeps. This sped up transportation considerably. Those are just a couple of the advances in technology that really had an impact in World War I. If one side had had these weapons and not the other, it could have ended very shortly. Unfortunately, both sides were coming up with new weapons and using these at the same time, and all it meant was things were drawn out very long and a lot of people died. So the World War I kind of ended the Industrial Revolution, and while other things were invented after that, the huge influx of inventions, it just wasn't there. Those other time periods, they're known for other things, not the inventions. So that ends our segment on the Industrial Revolution. Keep your eyes open for the next segment, which is on World War I and how to pick the right friends. See you then.